Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Angela. It's actually 10 past 11 on a Saturday night here. So this is my Saturday night party. It's a marshmallow party. Okay, so let me jump straight into it. So I'm going to start with an experiment that's very famous and which probably all of you are familiar with. It's going to set the scene for the discussion. And that's the marshmallow experiment. So back in the late 60s and early 70s, Walter Mischel, I remind you, did this series of experiments. The basic paradigm was kids around the age of 4, some a little older, some a little younger, had a delay of gratification task. So the task was basically, here's a marshmallow, or for kids who don't like marshmallows particularly, here's an Oreo cookie or a pretzel. And you can have it now or as soon as you choose. Or if you wait until the experimenter comes back, you can have 2. So this is a delay of gratification task on the assumption, that plausible assumption, the kid prefers 2 of the reward to 1, but in order to get 2, it's going to have to delay gratification. This is a self-control task. What makes it a self-control task? I'm not a very traditional philosopher. I'm not in the business of giving necessary and sufficient conditions or even trying to chase them. So let me just tell you what a typical self-control task is like. The typical self-control task is a task in which agents need to forego smaller, sooner rewards in order to get larger, later rewards that conflict with them. So paradigm self-control tasks, hackneyed example, I want to lose weight, that's my larger, later reward, but I'm tempted by this cupcake. That's my smaller, sooner reward. They conflict. Why? Because if I eat the cupcake, well, it's not a logical incompatibility. Nevertheless, there's a conflict between eating the cupcake now and having a healthy body weight in 3 months' time. It's a relatively weak conflict. You can get much stronger conflicts. My larger later reward might be have enough money for a comfortable retirement. The conflicting smaller sooner reward might be buy this Porsche car. It's not a logical impossibility, but if I spend, I don't know what Porsches cost these days, 180,000, it's much less likely I'm going to have enough money for my retirement. So this is a self-control task because the child wants a larger later reward, 2 marshmallows, and in order to get it, it's got to forego a smaller, sooner reward, 1 marshmallow. Okay, the experiments threw up a host of fascinating data, some of which I'll talk about later. What I want to focus on right now, because it's germane to the topic of the conference, is the predictive power of at least some versions of the marshmallow test. So 10 years later, they were finding that some variants of the test were predicting, for example, capacity to concentrate in class as rated both by parents and by teachers. They were predicting likelihood of getting into trouble with the law. A little later, they were predicting SAT scores. A recent follow-up with the same cohort, they're about my age, they're now in middle age, found that the delay time at age 4 or thereabouts It's predicting activity in executive areas in middle age. So it looks as though Michel was producing data which shows that self-control is a stable character trait. Okay, I will now put that together with a second and rather more recent tradition or body of work in social psychology on the ego depletion hypothesis. So the ego depletion hypothesis, almost as famous as the marshmallow experiment, is a set of experiments purporting to establish that self-control is or depends on a depletable resource. So it goes like this. Standard experiments in the hypothesis are between subjects designs. So you've got two groups of subjects, control group and an experimental group, random assignment, of course. Each group gets a task to perform that's matched for perceived aversiveness and duration, but only one group, the experimental group, gets a task that requires much in the way of self-control. So the task might be something like the marshmallow task. The very early ego depletion experiment had the experimental group taste radishes in a lab which was filled with the smell of freshly baked cookies, which were arrayed before them. They were left alone with the cookies. Or the task might be a self-regulation task, as psychologists call it. For example, the Stroop task, where you have to name the color of the ink in which words are printed. Sounds pretty easy. It's not that easy when the words themselves are the names of colors and they're discordant. They don't match the color in which they're written. So you have to say blue when red is written in blue. That requires overriding the overlearned response to read the word. For most of us, reading is automatized. So that requires self-regulation, or it might be control emotions while watching a scary or a funny film, and so forth. Then for the dependent measure, both groups are given a self-control task. So any of the depleting tasks can also be tasked with the dependent measure. And the finding is relatively consistent. You have to take these effect sizes with something of a grain of salt because you don't know what's not getting reported, but relatively consistent, relatively large effect size. You're finding that the depletion group, i.e. subjects who had done a earlier self-control task, do significantly worse at the subsequent self-control task. So it looks as though self-control is or depends on a depletable resource. This is sometimes called the muscle model of self-control for the following reason. Self-control looks a lot like muscular strength. In the short term, it depletes just like muscular strength. If you ask me to do press-ups, there's a certain number I can do now. It would be a smaller number if I had recently been doing press-ups or some other task which calls upon upper body strength. And it looks like self-control is like that too. On the other hand, there's evidence that like muscular strength, practicing self-control builds it up over time. So there's not extensive evidence, but there's fairly good evidence that practicing self-control leads to better performance, not just at the task that's being practiced, but more generally on self-control tasks. Okay, so now we can put these two bodies of research together and we get the following. Self-control is a personality trait, a stable personality trait. It's what psychologists call trait self-control, and it consists in willpower. Willpower is the capacity effortfully to resist temptations. I might just say something about why all this matters. Well, self-control looks like a psychological equivalent of a Rawlsian primary good. So Rawls says, primary goods are goods such that no matter what you want in life, no matter what your conception of the good is, you're going to want more of this good. It's not going to interfere with any reasonable conception of the good, and it's going to be helpful to most. Self-control looks like that because almost anything worth doing, as far as I can see, pretty much everything worth doing that is distinctively human, shall we say, requires self-control. Think about the life of an academic. In order to write a paper, a conference paper, a journal article, or a book, you're continually going to have to resist smaller, sooner temptations because you can't get that book finished, you can't get that paper written if every time you face the question, shall I write tonight, knowing if I write tonight, at the end of the night, I'm still only going to be a little way advanced on my paper, or should I binge watch Game of Thrones instead? Smaller, sooner temptation, I'm assuming that Game of Thrones represents for you, although not for me, is going to, if it wins out, you're never going to get the paper written. You might think about the good of just having an intimate relationship. For most of us, I think that involves some kind of smaller, sooner, larger, later trade-off too. Okay, so it's important, this trait. It's a stable personality trait, it's got predictive power and consists in the capacity effortfully to resist temptations. Not so fast. People high in trait self-control, as measured on a scale, and the scale has predictive power, are not, in fact, high in willpower, where willpower is the capacity effortfully to resist temptations. Willpower is the capacity measured by the ego depletion paradigm. How do we know that? Well, there's some evidence. Imhoff et al. Depleted individuals using a modified Stroop task. They then gave them a ostensibly independent task, which was a taste rating task. The dependent measure was actually how many M&Ms they ate. The finding was that individuals higher in trait self-control actually consumed more M&Ms than non-depleted individuals. In fact, individuals more than one standard deviation below the mean in trait self-control showed virtually no effect of depletion on their consumption. So trait self-control seems actually to predict vulnerability to ego depletion. Further, in the non-depletion condition, individuals high in trait self-control did not consume fewer M&Ms than individuals low in trait self-control. So it's conferring vulnerability to depletion on the one hand, and it's not actually helping. You're not actually doing any better at resisting temptation, even when you're not depleted. Imhoff et al. Did a second experiment to replicate the effect, this time conceptual replication, if you like. This time the dependent measure was risky decision making. And again, they found individuals high in trait self-control were particularly vulnerable to depletion, as measured by propensity to make riskier decisions. All right, so one thing you could say is, well, turns out trait self-control is not a particularly good measure, let's get rid of it. Well, I don't think we should do that because the scale, the trait self-control scale, does have predictive power. It is a measure of something, and further, it predicts things that look like self-control. It predicts things like likelihood of getting involved on the wrong side of the law. It predicts things like scholastic achievement. And these are larger, later rewards, the achieving of which requires foregoing smaller, sooner temptations. So it looks as though it really is measuring self-control. So it's a measure of self-control that's not a measure of a capacity to resist temptation. So what is it a measure of? Well, more than one thing, I think. One, there are at least two ways of exercising self-control, pursuing larger, later rewards by foregoing smaller, sooner rewards. One is the method that the ego depletion hypothesis and the experiments in that tradition focus on, which is the capacity effectively, by force of will, to resist temptation, to use your willpower. Here's another way to do it. Avoid calling on willpower at all. How can you do that? Well, there are a variety of different ways you can do it. One is the Ulysses strategy. You remember Ulysses in the myth doesn't rely on his willpower to resist the siren's call because he knows it's not strong enough. Rather, he ties himself to the mast, such that no matter what he wants to do, he's not going to give in to the lure of the sirens. How do we do that? Well, hackneyed example, the time lock on the drinks cabinet. I don't need to exercise self-control and not open the drinks cabinet before, say, 6 p.m. because I can't open the drinks cabinet before 6 p.m. Another way to do it is to change the payoffs such that it's just less likely I'm going to find the smaller, sooner reward as tempting. For those who know Ainsley's work, you can think of this as making the payoff, the smaller, sooner reward, ensuring that your discount curves don't cross by making sure that the payoff is has a lower value. How do you do that? A variety of different ways of doing that. One is to buy the smaller tub of ice cream. How does that change the payoff matrix? Well, if I want to eat twice the amount of ice cream that's in the tub, I can. But now I've imposed the cost on myself because in order to eat more, I now have to go out to the shop and buy more. By buying the smaller ice cream, say at 3 p.m., I may thereby not quite bind myself to the mast, but change the structure of the payoffs when it becomes an issue at 9 p.m. tonight. I don't bind myself, but I make it less likely I give in. So there are a variety of, we'll manage ourselves such that we don't have to call on our willpower, or it'll be less, there'll be less need to willpower because the temptation itself won't be so tempting. Now, I suggest that individuals high in Pratt's self-control are using strategies like that. Why should we believe that? Well, one reason is it solves the puzzle we're presented with. Why do they seem to have self-control? Why do they score high on a scale which has predictive power, and the predictive power seems inexplicable except insofar as they're routinely pursuing larger, later rewards which have to conflict with smaller, sooner rewards. But another reason is there is a growing body of data which backs this up. So Imhoff, Schmidt, and Gerstenberg conducted a self-report study in which individuals high in trait self-control reported lower frequency of engaging in effortful control. Well, self-report studies are notoriously unreliable simply because people are prone, even people with sincere and good motivation, are prone to some degree of confabulation, bias, memory searches, and so forth. Further, there's a variety of different interpretations of why they report engaging in effort for self-control less often. Maybe they just find fewer things tempting. Hoffman et al. Conducted a study which addressed both worries. They used the methodology of direct experience monitoring. In this kind of paradigm, experience sampling. In this kind of paradigm, people wear a beeper standardly, and it goes off at random intervals, or it can be an app on your iPhone. And the reason to have it going off at random intervals is it controls for people's biased memory searches, for example, by prompting them at random intervals such that they won't be able to select particular incidents for report. Again, we're not questioning their sincerity, but we know people do this. So when the beeper went off, their subjects were asked to report whether they were then experiencing or had in the last 5 minutes experienced a desire, the strength of the desire, whether they experienced any conflict with regard to the desire, whether they attempted to resist the desire, and whether they'd actually acted on it. Higher trait self-control didn't correlate with lower desire strength. So as long as the people high in trait self-control just have kind of pallid kinds of personalities, they're just dull. Nor did it correlate with success in resisting desires when they were experienced. Rather, it correlated with fewer temptations, and in particular with fewer temptations from a set of temptations that in piloting that the subjects had identified, separate group of subjects, had identified as temptations which they thought would be particularly problematic in everyday life. So taken together, I think the evidence suggests that people high in trait self-control are not resisting desires, and they're not better at resisting desires. Instead, what they're doing is avoiding the occasion of desire, avoiding calling on their willpower. A more recent study by Ent, Baumeister, and Theis, this one published just in February of this year, produced more direct evidence for this. In study one, they asked people whether they avoided temptations, simply self-report, of course. People higher in trait self-control were significantly more likely to report that they avoided temptations. In study two, separate group of subjects, of course, they produced some direct evidence that this wasn't mere confabulation. The task was roughly this. Subjects were given a task to perform, and they had to choose the environment in which they choose to perform the task. The first environment was interesting but distracting. The second environment was boring and non-distracting. And people higher in trait self-control were more likely to choose the boring environments in which to conduct the task. It looks as though individuals higher in trait self-control have hit upon the strategy of not calling upon their willpower, and that's how they're pursuing the larger later rewards by avoiding the smaller sooner temptations which conflict with them. Here's another reason to believe this story. It explains why high trait self-control is conferring vulnerability to ego depletion. Remember, individuals high in trait self-control were showing much more ego depletion than individuals lower. In fact, those who were very much lower were showing virtually no depletion effect. Well, remember the muscle model of willpower. Muscles atrophy if you don't use them. Similarly, it seems, Self-control is built up over time. We don't actually know that willpower is built up over time. We don't know that it gets worse with not being used, but we do know, or at least we have good grounds to believe, it doesn't get better. Well, people high in trait self-control are avoiding the gym, the mental gym. And we should expect that they have puny willpower. And that's exactly what we see. When they have to exercise their willpower, utilize, I should avoid the exercise, push that metaphor as far as it can go, utilize their willpower, they don't have much to call on. And we're seeing this vulnerability shown up in their sad results in the ego depletion paradigm. They're in the business of controlling their environment to the extent they can. The psychologists are in the business, standardly, of preventing them using that strategy by controlling the environment for them, not giving the option of avoiding the temptation. They don't have the option, therefore, of using their favorite strategy. Let's start drawing some morals now for the kind of question that Christian's been asking us to focus on. So, do high trait self-control individuals have the character trait of self-control? Here are two reasons for saying no. The first is somewhat speculative. We need some experimental philosophy to answer it. I'm guessing that when people ask a question, insofar as they ask, is so-and-so someone with the character trait of self-control, people don't quite put it like that, they're probably asking, the folk are probably asking about willpower. At least that's an important component in what they're asking. Why do I think that? Well, largely due to the talk about willpower in so much everyday talk about smoking and gambling and diets in particular. As I say, that's somewhat speculative, and it'd be good to get some experimental evidence for that. Insofar as that's the case, though, I think we should deny that individuals high in trait self-control have the character trait self-control, because of course they're not high in willpower. Just the opposite, they're actually low in willpower. Here's a second reason to deny that individuals high in trait self-control have the character trait self-control. I think when we say X has a character trait, we mean that they have an internal state or a set of internal states which are proprietary to a domain of behavior and which explain their success in that domain directly. So if somebody's able to face great danger, for instance, and that the reason they do it, the reason they can do it is they're disposed upon detecting the possibility of danger to enter into a fantasy world or to drink a huge amount of alcohol, whatever it might be, I think we would deny they have courage, because though they have internal states which explain their success at facing danger, those internal states don't explain their success at facing danger directly enough. I think trait self-control individuals are in the business of bringing it about that they exercise self-control pretty indirectly. Further, I think they're bringing it about using mechanisms, skills, processes, dispositions which are not proprietary to the domain of self-control, but are more domain general than that. How you manage your environment is domain general. It's a set of skills which are not specific to self-control. But I think they're also using other skills and dispositions, and I'm going to turn to them now too. I think they're also not specific to the domain of self-control. To turn to them now, to uncover them, I'm going to return once more to Mitchell's marshmallow studies. So, Mitchell, like most psychologists who conducted most research, was in the business of controlling the subject's environment such that subjects are forced to rely on particular states or mechanisms or processes or strategies and avoid others. That's a perfectly valid thing to do insofar as a psychologist wants to hone in on just those states or processes. For high-trait self-control individuals, he was not giving them the opportunity to use their favored strategy. If their only strategy for self-control was environmental management, then we would expect the data to lack predictive power explained by high-trait self-control, and I don't think that's what we do see. The reason we don't see that is because high-trait self-control individuals, I'm going to suggest, have skills and dispositions other than the disposition to manage their environments, which they were able to utilize even though Mitchell cut off their favorite strategy from them. Mitchell's initial hypothesis was that the more kids could see the rewards, the better they were going to be at pursuing them. The hypothesis seems pretty plausible. You know, the idea is you see what you're working towards and that motivates you, and you get an extra burst of energy or whatever it might be, so you're more successful at it. So he had four conditions, 2 by 2 rewards, hidden rewards, obscured, 1 reward, 1 marshmallow, 2 marshmallows, so 2 by 2, 4 conditions. Contrary to his hypothesis, delay was actually longest when neither reward was available, and shortest when both rewards were visible. I think that's what we should expect in the light of the ego depletion literature. Why do we expect that? Well, you got your rewards available. To the extent your attention is captured by them, you find them tempting. You're drawing on your willpower. Willpower is depletable. 4-year-olds have very little willpower. You expect them to give in rapidly. On the other hand, rewards obscured, their attention's not captured, they're not as reliant on willpower, you expect them to wait longer. You'd expect to see differences in adults too across those conditions. However, delay was not simply a function of condition, and there was individual differences across all the conditions. There are strategies and skills available other than the strategy of environmental management, which subjects were cut off from. Strategies which Mitchell himself uncovered. Children in particular use strategies of self-distraction, and later work showed that they were quite conscious, at least a little later, of using such skills, of self-distracting themselves. For example, they turned their backs so that they weren't facing the rewards. They sang songs, they played games, they attempted to fall asleep, in one case successfully, and so forth. These are ways of avoiding having to resist the temptation, because all going well, you forget about the temptation, and it may well be that there's such a thing as unconscious drawing on willpower, but it seems as though to the extent your attention isn't focused on the reward, you're not depleting your willpower as rapidly or as much. The second set of strategies that are available are strategies of construal. And it's actually, I was going to say big, that's not true. It's actually a small literature suggesting that construal may in fact be a rival explanation of what's going on in the ego depletion literature. I don't think it is, but it's probably an important part of the picture. There's construal level explanations for all kinds of phenomena. Among other things, there are construal level explanations for self-control. Roughly, the more you focus on the lower level properties of temptations, the features of the temptations specific to the temptation, the more likely you are to give in rapidly. The more you focus on high level properties, what it shares with other temptations, and the broader the class, the better, the longer you resist. Mischel found that cueing, what we would now call construal, was able to either increase or decrease delay. So giving kids distracting fun thoughts increased delay, getting them to focus on the temptation, and thereby getting to focus on those lower level properties, decreased delay. So what we're seeing is differences in delay time, including successful delay, which is the delay, success here is defined by waiting until the experimenter returns, is explained by individual differences, but individual differences in skills, strategies, and dispositions, not in willpower. Instead, self-control is drawing on domain general skills like skills in directing your thoughts, skills in construal, skills in self-distraction, and these things are explaining delay times. Willpower isn't doing very much here because willpower is fragile. It's rapidly depletable. That's not to say willpower isn't part of the story. Probably willpower is part of the story of self-control. You need willpower to get going. So Mischel notes that in the both rewards available condition, almost no one was getting very significant delay. Why? In that condition, attention is captured, and you probably need willpower to overcome that initial capture of your attention, such that you can start deploying these other skills and strategies. You've got to be able to turn your attention to something else, and for that you probably need to call upon willpower. But willpower just gets you going. Don't rely on it for long, because you're not going to have it for long. Instead, use your willpower to immediately turn to something that doesn't require willpower. Now, if this story is true, then one of the upshots is that self-control is probably a lot more teachable than we think, and teachable using different kinds of strategies than we would think. Insofar as self-control is a character trait, as conceptualized by Aristotelians, we're going to think it's going to be taught by presenting people with exemplars, paradigms, stories, and it's going to be taught by habituation. Now, all of those things probably are going to be helpful. There's probably going to be a place for them, but insofar as it's actually drawing on domain general skills, strategies, I'm nodding, Angela, dispositions to construe, that it may well be able to be taught in a much more explicit, rule-guided, formulaic way. We may not need to inculcate it. We may be able to teach it via knowledge that, if you like me and still think there's a knowledge that versus knowledge how distinction, notwithstanding Jason Stanley, you may be able to teach self-control via more knowledge that routes. So that would have a big implication for educational philosophy you look at what they say in educational philosophy about self-control, it's very Aristotelian. I want to finish by some lessons for psychology. So psychologists are, of course, rightly concerned with ecological validity, where ecological validity is roughly caring that what you're measuring is a real-world property that explains real-world differences between people. One lesson here, I think, is ecological validity is not simple. What counts as ecologically valid may, in a way, be participant relative, because different people have different strategies. A task which for some individuals may model a challenge they face in the world outside the lab, may for other individuals not model a task they face outside the lab, because they're in the business of avoiding tasks like that. I think that's what individuals high in trait self-control, that's a description that they fit. They're in the business of avoiding calling on willpower. That's why they're so bad at it. And willpower studies are less ecologically valid for them than it is for people lower in trait self-control. They're not irrelevant because they face willpower challenges too. But they obscure genuine differences. So ecological validity may be something that needs to be thought a little deeper. And there's a broader moral here, and I think it's a moral for philosophers as well. Insofar as we're interested in explaining real-world success, we shouldn't be interested just in individuals. We need to be interested in individuals embedded in their environment. So I'm repeating here a message that people like Andy Clark have been hammering home. And Andy Clark has this nice example of people with dementia. There's a standard neuropsychological test for people's functioning, such that falling below a certain point on the scale indicates inability to function in the community. The scale is relatively good in its predictive power, but there is a subset of individuals for whom it doesn't have the predictive power. They're falling well below that cut-off point, and yet they're functioning fine. Why? Because they're relying on strategies which the scale is ignoring. They're relying on strategies which are not simply brain-based. They are in the business of managing their environment such that they can function in the community a lot longer. They do things like take the doors off their cupboards so they can see everything, so it doesn't matter that they don't remember where things are. They're in the business of covering everything with post-it notes so that they give themselves guidance. iPhones, in fact, have been giving people with dementia all kinds of capacities they didn't have before. So it's just generalizing now. Insofar as we're concerned with the states and processes that predict how people are doing in the environment, we shouldn't just be concerned with internal states and processes. So I think that's a lesson for psychologists and philosophers. Thank you.
So I'm gonna get the commentators first.
Hey Neil, this is Chandra.
Hey Chandra.
How you doing? I wanted to thank you very much for the very stimulating presentation. Really interesting set of observations, and I think I agree with many of the observations. In passing, I wanted to say that in the Imhoff article that I had never seen before, it's really fascinating, they do cite like a half a dozen other studies that got the opposite result. And they say, oh, well, there's problems with the wall study and so on. So I just want to highlight, like everything in ego depletion, this finding is likely to be contested and it's going to be murky. But I want to take on board your observations. I don't want to just play this kind of, deny the premise. I want to go with you on one of your conclusions. And The one that I think is really striking is the idea that when domain general processes and capacities are implicated in a trait, that we should question the reality of that trait. And I get the reason why that would seem plausible. But at the same time, if we try to unpack how other traits are structured, I wonder if a similar charge could be made. And an example might be something like kindness, where if you unpack the underlying structure of it, presumably there would be mentalizing types of capacities, empathic kinds of capacities, various epistemic capacities, various regulatory capacities to hold back, as Daryl talked about. And then what you also have is something more like a value or a caring for somebody else's well-being. So a lot of traits will probably be structured with a kind of very focal motivational or desiderative core and various domain general capacities that result in the consistent dispositional patterns that we observe and the kinds of things that we can measure. So I wonder if the claim that self-control involves various, presumably a motivational core, caring about your future self, as well as various epistemic and strategic and managerial capacities, that may not be that dissimilar in the case of self-control for other traits. Maybe you'll say so much the worse for all traits, or maybe there'll be principal differences you'll identify. Thanks.
Right. So I don't want to say so much the worse for all traits because, I mean, that sounds cheap. It sounds like, insofar as I'm making a conceptual move here, then revision would seem, if it were the case that they all depend on domain general stuff, it would seem that revision is going to be more plausible than elimination in a case like this. I'm certain that all traits depend partly on domain general stuff, insofar as you grant me domain general stuff. Some people, of course, won't. But when, in your example of kindness, as you listed the set of states and processes that are going to be involved, one of them seemed to be core and specific to the domain, and that was a caring about others. And so my claim is that self-control lacks that core proprietary state or module, whereas others don't. Now, to make this plausible, I'm going to have to go through a few, and if it turns out, even if you were to grant me kindness, you may say, oh well, there are a half a dozen which look more like they fall on the self-control divide than on the kindness divide. And insofar as that's right, then again, vision's going to be more plausible. So I think we're going to have to work through them and see how they go. And I'm not betting I'm going to win this one, but yeah, I have to have. Well, I'm not betting a lot of money I'm going to win this one. We'll have to go through them one by for a few and see how we go.
Good, thank you.
Hi. So I thought the idea that people who are high in trait self-control have less willpower was really interesting. I did want to question the use of marshmallow tasking in the depletion paradigm as a measure of willpower. One thing I'm wondering about is maybe the people that are high in trait self-control just have less desire to control themselves in that context. They might have done other things in their daily life to offset the marshmallows that they're about to eat or something like that. And so I guess I just wonder, unless you're sure that the desire is equivalent, desire to exercise willpower, it seems a little tricky to say that that task is going to give you a good measure of their ability to exercise willpower. So I just wonder
Right.
if you could comment on that.
Now, Chandler's just reminded me of the Imhoff data, and I should say, Chandler's just pointed out something which I don't recall about Imhoff, because it's a while since I read it, Imhoff et al. But as I recall, they did in fact check that diet mattered for individuals prior to giving them a dependent measure. So they were people who were motivated to avoid junk food, or took themselves to be motivated to avoid junk food.
That's right.
There's the other, no, that second reply is not going to work. I'll try, I won't start on it.
You and then.
Hi Neil, it's Walter. I wanted to ask a kind of a big picture question about what the framework is, because it seems like, I mean, a lot of it was great, and I understood, I'm not sure whether it shows that willpower is no part of it. Why don't we say instead that self-control is just a small likelihood of acting impulsively in ways that undermine our long-term projects? And there are two ways to do it. You know, one is willpower, the direct way, and the other is the indirect way, which is environment management. And it turns out the environment management works better, which explains why people who are high in trait self-control, we use that method instead of the willpower method. But it doesn't mean that the other one isn't also a different method, which, by the way, might be more useful in other circumstances for other types of cases. So when you have a temptation that's going to be repeated time after time after time in your life, the best strategy is the environment management strategy. But you still have to have the willpower for those times when you run into something unexpectedly and the management didn't fail. And so we evolved with these two backup systems so that overall they'll work together to keep us from acting impulsively. That seems like a little bit different than the picture you were pushing, where we got to decide is it one or the other. And I'm not sure why you can't have it both ways.
Yeah. No, I think I do want to say, I do want to adopt the picture you're urging. Maybe what you're hearing in my presentation is a holdover from an earlier view of mine, where criticizing people like Richard Holton, I said, Richard says willpower is a domain-specific capacity. It's a module. And I said, well, actually it isn't. It's not domain-specific. Why? Because depleting tasks turn out to be much broader than the domain of self-control. And the dependent measure, what's depleted, turns out to be much broader than the domain of self-control. Roughly, and if you like the language, system 2 tasks are depleting, and depletion undermines success at system 2 tasks. To use the Stanovich and West or Kahneman style language. I'm quite partial to the language, except I'd say process rather than system. I don't think it's a well-behaved system. Now I'm starting to think, well, it's all pretty domain general, so that's not a reason to deny that when it's used for negotiating the smaller sooner or larger later trade-off, it's still self-control. I do want to have something like your picture. I just want to say it turns out not to be as important in the domain of self-control as we've tended to think.
Neil, this question comes from George Graham. Nice
Hey.
to meet you. Good. When we're looking at willpower and understanding that in part as selecting a larger later good over a smaller, more immediate good. It helps, it seems, to have sufficient power of imagination so that when we mentally time travel, the person we've got out there who is enjoying the later, larger good is a person with whom we can quite readily identify. That ability to more readily identify with the future person seemed to be missing in the account you offered. Not that it can't be added, but I think it should be. And let me just mention one reason why I think it should be. The metaphor of muscle power is pregnant with its explanatory utility, but it lacks the kind of imaginative vivacity that frequently is required when we're thinking of both our past and our future self, and when we're thinking of the effects we have on other people's behavior. So this is not so much a question as a suggestion that what might seem a very salient and important feature has to be added to the account here, and I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I thought about this a little bit. Pascal Boyer has a paper in Ticks a few years ago now, arguing that mental time travel actually evolved in part. One of the selection pressures was for self-control. He suggested that, and so the picture was essentially that imagining yourself receiving the reward in the future was itself rewarding and thereby motivated you to better exercise control. Now I can't remember where, but I believe I've read some data which suggests that's not the case. That actually, rather, it's just the opposite, that imagining yourself receiving the reward actually seems to undermine the motivation to exercise self-control. Now that's not, mental time travel has more aspects than that. I mean, you talked about identifying with the future self. That may not have to be done by actually imagining yourself receiving the reward. So that's one reason just to be careful about thinking about the role of mental time travel in self-control, but it may still have a place. But I haven't thought about, beyond that, I haven't thought about it.
Thank you.
Hi Neil, it's Eddie Namias back.
Hey, Eddie.
Great talk. If you haven't thought of it yet, it seems like the title should be Trait Self-Control is not the trait of self-control. And I think it's important to sort of emphasize that you're challenging what I agree with you would be the folk notion of self-control, because it would help us change our emphasis in what we are doing to make people more self-control, get them to change their environment rather than trying to build up this internal muscle. My question is, well, maybe it's a comment that you can comment on. So drawing on George's last remark and Chandra's remark, I'm wondering whether there is this sense, it might be related to Aristotle's notion that there's one unifying virtue of practical reason, and then it gets maybe played out in different ways or different domains. So it might be that what you're helping us see is that something like self-control draws on a general ability of practical reasoning to structure your environment properly, and then, as George and Chandra were suggesting, it plays out in the domain of caring about your future self, which, by the way, is, you said it was a Rawlsian primary desire, but it comes in degrees, and some people just might not care about their future self as much and enjoy the short-term satisfaction of desire more than others. And then kindness would be using practical, your practical wisdom to help others, maybe, and courage would be using your practical wisdom to avoid whatever. So you can apply it in different areas. But then there's another worry about how that might get cashed out in the data from the show. It might just be that what you and he are calling trait self-control is just having something like general intelligence, or maybe it's IIQ or something like that, and then that's a common cause for some of these other effects, like doing well on the SAT or higher job salary or whatever. So I don't know what the question there is exactly, but something along the lines of drawing on what others have said about this not being, this drawing on a general capacity, but in a particular domain, and then make this worry about a common cause explanation for the effects.
Yeah, there's some work on what in self-control correlates with G. And the answer is far from perfectly, but somewhat. There is some degree, then G may not correlate perfectly with practical wisdom either. So that's not a reason to think your suggestion is going to is going to be a non-starter. Yeah, I want to think about that a bit more. Let me just comment on one thing you said, which was some people may just want to enjoy short-term rewards. That's perhaps Frank, that's one thing I like that. But in a sophisticated hedonist actually needs self-control because a sophisticated hedonist doesn't want to set themselves up for a life of misery very rapidly. But that's not a good way of pursuing hedonism. So a sophisticated hedonist is themselves in the business of avoiding trading themselves. And Asia's got a very good paper on how, if your aim is simply to maximize pleasure, you've got to do all kinds of things, he thinks quite self-deceptively, to avoid pleasure, because you get jaded rapidly. And also just because, you deplete your resources and you set yourself up for a life of misery. But that was an aside. Now I want to think more about the Aristotelian Aristotle without the virtues picture you suggested.
So should we make this the last question?
Hi Neil, thanks for the great talk. This is Raul Cicito. I like the general teasing apart willpower from this more general skills that you've focused on. But I want to distinguish between two very different kinds of skills that seem relevant. The ones that are avoidance related, so the ones that involve me either modifying my environment or myself so that I'm not exposed to the relevant phenomenon, and the ones that are exposure actually related. So to illustrate, think about how people deal with phobias. Suppose that I have a phobia of spiders, and I can altogether try to avoid spiders and never go to Australia, never go to corners in my house and so on. I can also just never want to think about spiders and just think about marshmallows and whatever else. But I can also, and this is in fact the way that phobias tend to be treated in a clinical setting and in a very effective way, is by exposing yourself to the relevant phenomenon and by building some sort of affective resistance to the discomfort that you experience when you are exposed to the phenomenon or when you think about the phenomenon, right? So I was wondering if there's a difference between those two that would be relevant to your discussion. It seems that the ones that have to do with exposure, those skills, are more like willpower in that they, you can exercise them, so you can build more and more resistance to discomfort or tolerance with discomfort that, say, spiders present you. They also seem to be depletable and so on. So I was wondering if there's still something in the neighborhood of a muscle type phenomenon going on, even if we just focus on general skills, i.e. exposure related rather than avoidance related skills.
Yeah, I mean, exposure seems to be a little bit more like the kind of thing you can explain within a Skinnerian perspective rather than something that calls upon domain general capacities. I mean, for exposure, as I understand it, it leads to changing the associations essentially and extinguishing the desire. I think something that might be somewhat analogous within the domain of self-control, and here I'm just talking anecdotally, is bright lines. So I gave up chocolate and all such things, I suppose, 4 years ago. And now I have no trouble resisting these things. You stare at a candy bar, as you call it, all day long without any need to draw on my willpower, simply because it's not on my list of things I might eat. It's not a question. The question's closed for me. So I think you draw upon your willpower when the questions are open. But I think it's something like this. You make a resolution, but the resolution has implicit et-up clauses. Most resolutions do. I'm not going to stick to the resolution no matter what, and then you can easily self-deceive yourself. When the resolution has such thematic get-out clauses as a bright lines resolution, it's not easy to self-deceive yourself. So my sense is that that's more similar to the exposure example, because the exposure example, in the phobia case, doesn't draw on domain general capacities. But I think we're going to need to think about that a bit more.
Thank you so much, Neil, for a wonderful talk.